The year was 1683, and the balance of power in Europe hung by a thread. To the east stretched the vast domains of the Ottoman Empire, a realm that had risen from the Anatolian frontier to become one of the most formidable powers in human history. Its sultans had crushed Byzantium, carved deep into the Balkans, and shaken the gates of Christendom for more than 2 centuries. For the Ottomans, expansion was not merely conquest, but destiny, carried on the winds of faith and the thunder of armies. And now, under the rule of Sultan Mehmed IV, and the grand strategy of his brilliant yet ruthless Grand Vizier Kara Mustafa Pasha, that destiny pointed squarely toward Vienna. Vienna was more than a city. It was the heart of the Habsburg dominions, the western bulwark against the Ottoman tide. Its walls were strong, its defenders loyal, but its strategic position made it a prize of immense value. If Vienna fell, the road to Central Europe would lie open, and nothing would stand between the Ottomans and the rich heartlands of Germany. To conquer Vienna was to strike at the very core of Europe's survival, and so, in the spring of that year, a mighty host gathered. Some 300,000 soldiers, engineers, and camp followers surged across the Hungarian plains like a living tide, banners of green and crescent fluttering in the wind, the thunder of hooves shaking the earth, and the echo of drums proclaiming that destiny had arrived at Europe's doorstep. But within Vienna, a different spirit stirred. The city, though unprepared for such a massive onslaught, was determined to resist. Its population of fewer than 20,000 soldiers and citizens looked out at the approaching storm with fear, but also with the hard steel of defiance. Count Ernst Rüdiger von Starhemberg, the commander of the city's defense, rallied his people. He knew that Vienna's survival did not depend on its walls alone, but on the courage of its defenders and the hope that reinforcements might arrive before the Ottoman hammer shattered the gates. The siege began with an awe-inspiring spectacle of Ottoman engineering. Kara Mustafa's men set about digging trenches, constructing earthworks, and bringing forward massive cannons. Siege warfare was an art the Ottomans had perfected over centuries, and against them even the strongest fortresses had often crumbled. As the weeks dragged on, the ground around Vienna became a vast maze of trenches and tunnels, creeping ever closer to the city walls. Each night, the Viennese could hear the muffled thud of shovels, the groan of earth being moved, and sometimes the chilling sound of miners digging beneath their feet. The defenders responded with desperation and ingenuity. They dug countermines, crawling through the earth like moles to intercept the Ottoman tunnels. When they discovered charges of gunpowder buried beneath their walls, they rushed to flood them with water or smother them with sand. Time and again, subterranean battles erupted in the darkness, fought not with banners and shining armor, but with picks, shovels, and knives in the suffocating silence of earthbound caverns. Above ground, the city endured relentless bombardment. Cannonballs crashed into houses, churches collapsed, and fires tore through entire districts. Supplies grew scarce, and hunger gnawed at soldier and citizen alike. Disease followed close behind, spreading through the cramped shelters where families huddled in fear. Yet still the defenders held. Starhemberg walked the walls daily, his own body scarred from wounds sustained in battle, urging his men to endure just a little longer. Each sunrise brought hope that help might come, and each sunset tested the strength of their resolve. Beyond Vienna's walls, the Habsburg court had fled to safety, leaving the city to its fate. But the Emperor, Leopold I, knew that Vienna could not be abandoned entirely. He sent desperate pleas for aid to the princes of the Holy Roman Empire and to Poland's formidable king, John III Sobieski. Only by uniting the fractured powers of Christendom could Vienna be saved. Yet, alliances were slow to form, and time was running out. Inside the besieged city, every day felt like an eternity, and every explosion threatened to bring the final collapse. As the summer wore on, the Ottomans pressed their advantage. Kara Mustafa was confident, for he had the numbers, the experience, and the will of an empire behind him. His soldiers, elite Janissaries clad in flowing robes and armed with muskets, fought with relentless discipline. His cavalry, the fearsome Sipahis, waited like a coiled serpent to devour the countryside once the city fell. He believed that Vienna was doomed, and with its fall, the Habsburgs would be crippled, leaving the road open all the way to Rome itself. Yet Kara Mustafa was not without flaws. His ambition was vast, but his caution often restrained him. Unlike earlier Ottoman commanders who would have stormed the city with reckless ferocity, Kara Mustafa sought to capture Vienna intact, a jewel to present to his sultan. He avoided wasteful assaults, preferring instead to strangle the city slowly, tightening the noose until its people broke. This decision gave the defenders a precious gift: time. Time for messengers to slip through the lines, time for reinforcements to gather, and time for Europe to realize the magnitude of the threat. In distant Krakow, King John III Sobieski received word of Vienna's plight. A seasoned warrior, Sobieski understood both the strategic and spiritual importance of the city. If Vienna fell, Poland itself would be exposed. But Sobieski was not merely a monarch defending his realm. He was a man driven by the conviction that the struggle against the Ottomans was a holy duty. He agreed to march to Vienna's aid, uniting his army with the German and Austrian forces gathering under the banner of the Holy League. It was a coalition born of necessity, for old rivalries and mistrust still lingered among the Christian princes. Yet the shadow of the Ottoman crescent loomed larger than any quarrel, and so the armies marched. Inside Vienna, the defenders clung to rumors of Sobieski's approach like a lifeline. They whispered of the winged hussars, Poland's fearsome cavalry, whose charges were said to break armies as a hammer shatters glass. Still, weeks passed and the Ottomans drew ever closer. The outer walls crumbled, breaches widened, and the defenders were pushed back to their inner lines. Starhemberg, though wounded and weary, refused to yield. He swore that Vienna would hold until help arrived, or until the last defender fell upon the rubble. By August, the walls of Vienna bore the scars of unrelenting bombardment. Towers that once stood proud now lay in heaps of rubble, their shattered stones forming jagged mounds against the skyline. Whole districts had been reduced to ash, their inhabitants forced to take shelter in the cellars of ruined homes. The air was thick with the acrid stench of smoke, mingled with the cries of the wounded and the constant thunder of Ottoman artillery. Each night, flames lit the horizon, and each dawn revealed new scars gouged into the heart of the city. Within the fortress walls, despair threatened to take root. Rations had grown perilously thin. Horses and dogs had long since disappeared from the streets, sacrificed to stave off starvation. Bread was mixed with sawdust, wine with water, and yet these meager supplies could not satisfy the hunger gnawing at soldiers and civilians alike. Mothers hushed their crying children with empty promises of food, while men tightened their belts and clung grimly to their posts on the ramparts. Yet even in this darkness, sparks of defiance burned. Starhemberg led from the front, limping through the ruined streets with his bandaged arm, speaking to soldiers by name, urging them not to surrender. Priests carried crucifixes along the battlements, blessing the weary men and reminding them that their sacrifice was not for Vienna alone, but for all of Christendom. The city had become a symbol, a beacon of resistance that the Ottomans could not extinguish by cannon fire alone. Outside the walls, Kara Mustafa's camp stretched for miles, a city of tents and banners. His army, though vast, was not immune to hardship. The length of the campaign and the ferocity of the resistance strained his supplies. The surrounding countryside had been stripped bare, and disease began to seep through the crowded encampments. Still, Kara Mustafa remained confident. He believed that Vienna could not last much longer, and that soon he would send word to the Sultan of a triumph greater than any before. Yet whispers began to stir among his officers, for rumors had reached them that armies were on the move, converging upon Vienna from the west. Kara Mustafa dismissed these fears, insisting that no relief could arrive in time. He would break the city before then, and Europe would bow before the crescent. Far beyond the besieged city, a vast coalition was indeed gathering. From Bavaria, Saxony, Franconia, and Swabia came German regiments, their banners bearing eagles and crosses, marching to defend the heart of the empire. From Austria itself came remnants of shattered armies, desperate to reclaim their capital. But the greatest ally of all was Poland, and at its head rode a king whose very name struck fear into the hearts of his enemies, John III Sobieski. Sobieski was no ordinary monarch. He was a soldier king, hardened by decades of warfare, famed for his victories against the Ottomans and Tatars alike. His most fearsome weapon was his cavalry, the famed winged hussars, resplendent in armor, their great lances gleaming, and their wings of eagle feathers rising like halos above their shoulders. Legends told that when these riders charged, the very earth trembled, and no army could withstand their fury. As Sobieski gathered his forces in Krakow, he addressed his men with words that carried across the campfires. Vienna was not merely a Habsburg city, he declared. It was the shield of Europe. To let it fall would be to invite the Ottomans into their own homes, their own hearths, their own faith. His speech was met with thunderous cries of loyalty, for his soldiers knew they were about to ride into a battle that would decide not just kingdoms, but civilizations. The march to Vienna was no simple task. Mountains and rivers lay in their path, and the army, numbering close to 70,000, was burdened with supply trains and heavy artillery. Yet the soldiers pressed on with tireless determination, urged forward by the knowledge that every day lost brought Vienna closer to ruin. Villages emptied to cheer their passage, and church bells rang in their honor, for all knew that salvation, if it came at all, would come with Sobieski. Meanwhile, within the besieged city, the defenders endured their darkest hours. The Ottoman mines had breached the outer walls, creating gaping holes through which the Janissaries surged in furious assaults. Each time, the defenders fought them back with fire, steel, and sheer desperation, piling corpses in the breaches to hold the line. Starhemberg himself, bleeding from yet another wound, wrote letters declaring that Vienna would fight until the very end. But in his heart, he knew the city could not hold much longer. Unless help arrived, all was lost. As September approached, the fate of Vienna hung in the balance. The Ottomans had nearly broken through, their trenches reached the very foot of the inner walls, and explosives had shattered key fortifications. Starhemberg's men could no longer rest, for the attacks came day and night, a ceaseless tide of fire and steel. The people of Vienna, gaunt and hollow-eyed, prayed constantly, their churches filled with candlelight and whispered supplications. Some despaired that God had abandoned them, while others clung to faith as their only weapon left. And then, on the horizon, hope appeared. Scouts slipped into the city with word that Sobieski's army had crossed the Danube and was marching with furious speed. The defenders erupted in desperate joy, for the promise of salvation was no longer a rumor but a certainty. Starhemberg ordered the bells to ring, their tolling echoing through the shattered streets. For the first time in months, smiles lit weary faces. The city had endured long enough. Deliverance was at hand. Kara Mustafa, however, was undeterred. He too had received word of the approaching coalition, but his pride blinded him to the danger. He believed his massive army could destroy the relief force just as easily as it would crush the defenders of Vienna. He tightened his siege lines, determined to take the city before Sobieski arrived. Yet time was no longer his ally. The relief army was closer than he imagined, and the fate of Europe was about to be decided on the fields and hills surrounding Vienna. As the sun set on the 11th of September, the defenders braced for another night of terror, unaware that beyond the hills, tens of thousands of soldiers camped under the same sky, sharpening their blades, saying their prayers, and preparing for a dawn that would bring the greatest battle of their age. On the evening of September 11th, the hills north of Vienna stirred with the fires of an army encamped. The coalition had arrived at last. Germans, Austrians, Bavarians, Saxons and Poles stood side by side, tens of thousands strong, their banners fluttering against the twilight sky. The soldiers, hardened by long marches and the weight of expectation, sharpened their swords, tightened their armor, and murmured prayers in a dozen tongues. Though they came from different lands, spoke different words, and carried the pride of rival princes, they were united now by a single purpose: to break the siege and save Vienna. At the heart of the camp, King John III Sobieski walked among his men. His presence was calm but commanding, the gaze of a monarch who had spent a lifetime at war. He knew the stakes more clearly than any man. If they failed, the Ottomans would not stop at Vienna. The Danube would carry their fleets deeper into Europe, and the spires of Rome itself might tremble before the crescent. Sobieski knelt that night before a simple wooden cross, offering his fate and the fate of his army into God's hands. When he rose, it was with iron resolve. The plan for the coming battle was daring. The coalition would advance in a great arc from the wooded hills of the Kahlenberg, sweeping down upon the Ottoman positions that encircled the city. The terrain was rough and favored the defenders, yet Sobieski believed speed and audacity would carry the day. The Germans and Austrians would attack first, pressing the Ottoman flanks and drawing their strength away from the city walls. Then, when the moment was right, Sobieski and his cavalry would unleash a charge the world would never forget. Inside Vienna, the defenders heard the faint echoes of movement beyond the hills, but did not yet know salvation was so near. They braced for another day of endless assault, manning their crumbling walls with the last of their strength. The night passed with fire and thunder, but as the dawn broke on September 12th, the first light revealed not only the tattered banners of the Ottomans, but also the glint of armor in the forests above them. Hope surged like a tide through the weary city. Salvation had come at last. The morning of the battle dawned clear, the mist clinging to the slopes of the Kahlenberg. From his vantage point, Kara Mustafa saw the enemy arrayed against him. The sight was daunting. Wave upon wave of soldiers advancing in disciplined lines, their banners casting shadows upon the earth. For the first time, the Grand Vizier felt the creeping tendrils of doubt. Yet pride held him firm. His army was vast, his janissaries seasoned, his cavalry formidable. He believed that sheer numbers and discipline would crush the coalition before they could descend upon his camp. The clash began with thunder. German infantry surged forward, drums beating, muskets blazing. The hills echoed with the crack of gunfire and the roar of artillery. Cannonballs tore into the Ottoman ranks, while the defenders answered with their own thunder, turning the valleys into a storm of fire and steel. For hours the battle raged in the forests and fields, a grinding contest of will. The Ottomans fought with relentless courage, their janissaries standing firm as lines of Christian soldiers pressed upon them. Arrows darkened the sky and smoke clouded the hills. The earth shook as cavalry skirmished on the flanks, the Sipahis charging with curved sabers flashing, only to be thrown back by the disciplined pikes of the coalition. The battlefield became a cauldron of chaos, men fighting and dying for every inch of ground. Within Vienna, the defenders watched the battle unfold from their battered walls. They cheered as they saw the banners of their allies advancing, and with renewed spirit, they launched sorties against the Ottoman trenches, adding to the confusion. The siege that had seemed so close to victory for Kara Mustafa was now unraveling before his eyes. Yet the true hammer blow had not yet fallen. As the day wore on, Sobieski watched from the heights, his cavalry massed behind him, waiting. He saw the Ottoman lines stretched thin, their energy consumed by the desperate struggle against the German and Austrian infantry. He saw the moment approaching, the perfect instant when the weight of one strike could shatter the enemy utterly. He raised his hand, and the greatest cavalry charge in European history began to form. The signal was given, and 70,000 horsemen surged forward, their thunder rolling like a storm through the valleys. At their head rode Sobieski himself, clad in shining armor, his presence towering above the rest. The winged hussars led the charge, their great wings of eagle feathers catching the sunlight, their lances lowered in a glittering line of steel. Behind them rode Polish lancers, German knights and Austrian cavalry, a tidal wave of hooves and fury descending upon the exhausted Ottoman ranks. The ground trembled beneath their charge. The very air seemed to shudder as the avalanche of men and horses swept down the slopes. Trumpets blared, banners snapped in the wind, and the thunder of hooves grew so deafening that men on the walls of Vienna swore it was the sound of heaven itself descending. The Ottomans, already battered and stretched thin, had no time to react. Their lines buckled beneath the impact as lances shattered shields and armor, and sabers carved through flesh and bone. The Janissaries, proud and disciplined, fought with desperate valor, but even they could not withstand the storm. The Sipahis tried to rally, but they were thrown back in a whirlwind of steel and trampling hooves. Kara Mustafa's grand army, the mightiest force the empire had sent into Europe in a century, collapsed beneath the fury of Sobieski's charge. From the city, the defenders erupted in cheers as they saw the Ottomans scatter. Starhemberg ordered a sally, and the Viennese poured out through their breaches, attacking the retreating enemy. What had begun as a desperate siege now became a rout. Ottoman soldiers fled in every direction, pursued by cavalry and cut down without mercy. The camp that had stretched for miles became a graveyard of burning tents and abandoned banners. As the sun set on September 12th, the battlefield was littered with the remnants of a broken army. Sobieski rode into Vienna through the shattered gates, greeted as a savior. Exhausted defenders embraced their rescuers with tears of joy, while bells pealed across the city in celebration. Europe had stood on the brink of collapse, but in one day, the tide had turned. The Ottomans were in retreat, and their dream of conquering the heart of Europe lay shattered in the dust. The morning after the battle, silence hung over the fields that had thundered with fury only hours before. Smoke curled lazily from the ruins of the Ottoman camp, drifting above broken wagons, abandoned cannon, and the bodies of men and horses strewn across the hillsides. The once proud banners of the Crescent lay trampled in the mud, their colors dimmed by blood and ash. Vienna, scarred and shattered but unbroken, stood as a monument to endurance. Sobieski entered the city not as a conqueror, but as a liberator. Starhemberg, weary and bandaged, embraced him at the gates. The two commanders united in a victory that seemed almost miraculous. The people of Vienna, gaunt from hunger and hollow-eyed from sleepless nights, gathered in the streets to cheer, their cries echoing through the ruined city like a hymn of resurrection. Bells tolled from churches whose steeples had somehow survived the bombardment, and priests led processions of thanksgiving, declaring the deliverance not merely a triumph of arms, but a gift of providence. For Sobieski, the moment was deeply symbolic. In a letter to the Pope, he declared with humility yet pride, "Venemus, vidimus, Deus vicit." We came, we saw, God conquered. To him, the victory was not his alone, but a divine act that had saved Christendom at its darkest hour. Yet he also knew that what had been won on the fields outside Vienna was not merely a reprieve, but a turning point. The Ottoman tide, which for centuries had surged relentlessly into Europe, had at last been broken. Far from Vienna, the news of defeat fell upon Kara Mustafa like a thunderbolt. The Grand Vizier had gambled everything on the siege, staking his honor, his ambition, and the glory of the empire on the fall of one city. And now that city stood unconquered, its defenders victorious, its allies triumphant. The dream of presenting Vienna as a jewel to Sultan Mehmed IV had crumbled into dust. Kara Mustafa retreated with the remnants of his army, trying to impose order upon the shattered ranks. But whispers of blame followed him like a shadow. His soldiers, who had once feared him, now muttered that his caution and pride had doomed them all. In the imperial court at Edirne, the Sultan's fury grew as reports of the disaster poured in. The defeat at Vienna was more than a failed siege. It was a humiliation, a rupture in the aura of invincibility that had long surrounded the Ottoman arms. By December of that year, Kara Mustafa's fate was sealed. Summoned before the Sultan's messengers, he was stripped of his rank and titles. The once mighty Grand Vizier, who had commanded one of the largest armies the empire had ever assembled, was executed by the silk cord, the traditional fate of those who had failed the throne. His ambition had reached for the heart of Europe, but his pride had delivered him to ruin. The siege of Vienna in 1683 was more than a battle, it was a fulcrum of history. For centuries, the Ottomans had advanced steadily into Europe, their banners reaching deep into the Balkans, their armies hammering at the gates of Hungary, Austria, and beyond. With the defeat outside Vienna, that advance came to an end. No longer would Ottoman armies threaten the heart of Europe with conquest. Instead, the long struggle between empires shifted. The Habsburgs seized the initiative, pressing into Hungary and pushing the Ottomans back, decade by decade, until much of their European territory was lost. For Europe, the victory was both a salvation and a beginning. It marked the resurgence of the Habsburg monarchy, the rise of Austria as a great power, and the forging of a new unity among Christian states. The memory of the siege became legend, retold in ballads and chronicles, celebrated in paintings and monuments. For Poland, it was the crowning glory of Sobieski's reign, immortalizing him as the savior of Christendom and the Lion of Vienna. Yet the legacy was not without complexity. The battle deepened the divide between East and West, casting the Ottomans not merely as rivals, but as the eternal adversaries of Europe. It hardened frontiers and fostered suspicions that would echo through centuries of conflict. And for the Ottomans themselves, the defeat sowed the seeds of decline, a slow unraveling of power that would stretch across generations until the empire, once feared as unstoppable, became the sick man of Europe. As the centuries passed, the memory of 1683 grew larger than the battle itself. It became a story told not only of armies and generals, but of civilizations colliding at the edge of collapse. Vienna stood as a symbol of survival, its walls scarred but unbroken, its spirit unyielding in the face of overwhelming force. The image of Sobieski charging at the head of his winged hussars became one of history's most dramatic moments, a thunderclap of destiny that turned the tide of an age. Yet the deeper truth lay not only in the clash of armies, but in the endurance of a city, the unity of nations once divided, and the resolve of a people who refused to bow even when surrounded by fire. The siege of Vienna was not merely the story of one day in September, but of months of hunger, fear, and defiance, culminating in a single decisive stroke that reshaped the course of the world. And so, the tale of 1683 endures, not as a relic of the past, but as a reminder of how close history came to a different path. Europe truly stood on the edge of collapse, its fate balanced on the walls of a single city. But when the dust settled, Vienna still stood, the crescent was turned back, and the dawn of a new age began.